The English language is a terrible minimalist. It hoards words, phrases, idioms, accents from all over the world, and in Sri Lanka, it has made itself very much its home here, and it has unpacked itself here, and it has simply thrown open all the windows. And it has made itself so much its home here, so much so that we don't necessarily have to have these old debates and conversations about whether what we speak is correct English or proper English, or if it is actually really English, if what we speak has all these local textures and flavors. But what is more interesting is what we do with English. So we have two award-winning writers here, Savin and Ciara, who have whose novels and short stories are brimming with Sri Lankan context, flavors, and textures. And then my job, well, I was appointed by the Oxford English Dictionary to provide them with some intel on how people like Savin and Ciara, and me, myself included, all of us who use English in Sri Lanka, how we use English in Sri Lanka. So that's my role, to give them intel on how we use English in Sri Lanka. So there was a period of time when it was necessary to have this conversation about Sri Lankan English. You know, users of Sri Lankan English have been arguing for years and decades about how Sri Lankan English is very much a legitimate variety of English. It's not a derivation, it's not broken, and it's not some sort of failed imitation of something that is British or American. And this whole conversation, this whole concept of proper English is anyway quite a violent, it is quite violent in itself, because it erases and silences other forms of speaking English. So here what we are interested in more is about how we use language, how we use English, and how we take up space, whether it is in our short stories or whether it is in our novels, in our roadside banter, in our WhatsApp conversations, or even in dictionaries. So, let's start the conversation here. So I think I'll ask my first question from Ciara. So English across your writing often flows with a lot of local expression and rhythms, and kind of you often blend in a lot of Sinhala in your writing as well. So would you say that this is a deliberate stylistic choice that you use, Sri Lankan English, or is it something that emerges organically from the stories that you're narrating anyway? And how do you decide when and when not to code switch and code mix with English?
Right. Thank you, Rochana. So I think answer to that question would be both. I think in my case, it is both organic and deliberate. If I'm to talk about how it becomes organic, first is because I think my writing is always a representation of how we usually talk in Sri Lanka. So being from like a multilingual country, we do code mix and switch often. So I think sometimes also like English fails me because I think the whole idea of code mixing and code switching is so there's this repertoire of expressions in your head, and when you want to express something, you pick the one that perfectly describes what you want to say. Sometimes it could be English, sometimes it could be Sinhala. So for an example, if we take something like Malung, how do you say Malung in English? It's not a salad. It's definitely not a sambal. I mean, we put a lot more effort into it than a sambal. And I think it's an insult to say that it's just greens, right? So you can even say it's like this hand-picked Ceylon greens mixed with freshly scraped coconut or something, but then again, it doesn't work. So in cases like that, I always use Malung. And also when we are portraying certain characters, because dialogues are very important. So when you say, especially like an expression like lejjai, mata lejjai, so the direct translation would be something like shame or embarrassment. But then again, when somebody says mata lejjai, it's not just shame. There's embarrassment, there's shame, there's moral judgment, there's social pressure. and there's the pressure of 3 Sri Lankan aunties looking at you from 3 different directions. So all these things, I think, so I just think about all these things and I always use what comes to my mouth. If I was that character, what I would say. Then again, sometimes there are also cases where I use it deliberately as a stylistic and often a political choice. Because when you use a Sri Lankan English expression or a Sinhala expression in a story, that makes the reader look into your culture a little bit. I have experienced this when I have been submitting stories to international journals, where when the stories are going through editing rounds, they ask you a lot of questions. But then again, when you explain it to them, they also look into your culture and they understand why you're using it. So things like that. So I think we don't have to protect the English reader from all these cultural references. We can just go ahead and use our references, because then it actually creates a link to your culture. So at cases like that, I have often used Sri Lankan English expressions like, maybe let's say, why men, or like ayane, instead of something like, oh no, why? You know, because oh no, why sounds a lot artificial. Then I think if you can watch a Korean drama for 5 minutes without subtitles and understand who is angry, who is in love, who is about to cheat, and who is about to betray somebody, I think you can survive one single sentence in my story.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. And also, the other word that I really dislike people using in English is oil cake for cow.
Yes.
I have never, I've always wondered why oil cake? I do not want to be eating an oil cake. My gosh. Yeah, so thank you very much. So very useful sentiments there. So I think Savin will also be able to contribute to that. So Savin, you've spoken about this and you've written about this, about how you did not grow up with English as your primary language. So how has that shaped the way you think and the way you inhabit English now, as, because I think you predominantly write in English now. English is your predominant writing language. So how do you kind of inhabit English, and what is the kind of voice that has emerged for you over the years?
Well, it's a tough act to follow, Shyam, but we'll try, we are trying. So, yeah. Thank you for that question. So, I think I don't know what the language I grew up in actually, because my father was a huge inspiration for me, and he studied Sinhala. So he did his masters in Sinhala as well. But the language was very much, how would I say, it's very open. I used to tell my father, Pisuda ban tatte. I say bang to my tatta. So it was a very colloquial in the sense it's much more than colloquial. The Sinhala we used when we were growing up. And then English. I was put into an English medium school because my father wanted me to study the one language that evaded him, which was English. And when I went to that international school, when I started speaking in English, the English that came out of me was something, it's kind of like a Frankenstein, I would say. So it's not English, it's not Sinhala, it's kind of like an interlanguage. I think that's what Sri Lankans have. It's an interlanguage. We can't pinpoint and say, okay, you're speaking a mix of Sinhala and English, or mix of Sinhala and Tamil, or Sinhala and Tamil and English, maybe, because a lot of people in Sri Lanka are trilingual. Most of them actually. So it's very difficult to pinpoint and say, okay, this is the language that you grew up in and this is the language you should speak. Because it's very much, salade. It's very much a malluma. So that's the best way to explain the language that I grew up with. But also, I like to break all the rules in English. I like to break rules in both the languages. So my lokutatta, my father's elder brother, was a principal. So he used to joke around saying, one book is one book, two books is de book. So deka plus book, deka is Sinhala for two. So and one duck, two ducks. So it's kind of that humor sort of language, and that gave me confidence, because there's this affective filter going around, especially among the Commonwealth countries about English. There's this inferiority complex, you know, I should speak proper English. But when you put humor into it, proper English doesn't make people laugh. I like to make people laugh because it means they love me. Maybe this is kind of like a therapy session going on, but you know, the humor humor is also another language basically. So that is the sort of Frankenstein language that I grew up with, and now I'm using as well. Yeah. So I think from there we can move on to Rochana as well, because Rochana has given the Oxford English Dictionary words that very similar to Malluma. It's the words that actually can't have a translation, and the milk rice thing that we often talk about. It's not milk rice, it's Kiribati. So I would like to ask you, Rochana, how important it is to have, you know, Sri Lankan words. And when we say Sri Lankan words, it's not just the word, it's the entire culture, it's the society, it's the history, it's the trauma, everything. So how important was it to, you know, take Sinhala words and make it global, and also to have it in a prestigious and a well-reputed you know, a collection like the Oxford English Dictionary? So how was that journey?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Savin. So yes, so in fact, Malung is in the dictionary now. That is one of the words I decided to add, as well as Kiribat, milk rice. So here's the thing. I remember when the edition came out, when the published words first came out, there were a lot of people who were quite puzzled. These are actually not English words. Like how come they're in the Oxford English Dictionary? Because they're not English. But then the question is, if you can use the word Kiribat, why use milk rice? So their point was that there is already a word for Kiribat, which is milk rice. No, but again, like you very clearly said, milk rice does not capture the nuance of Kiribat, because it means so much more than just the food item, right? I think this is shared across all cultures. Food is not just food. It has a lot of things attached to it. And the other thing is, a lot of people also said things like, oh, so the Oxford English Dictionary now has Kiribati in it, Koturoti in it, Malung in it. So that means we can use these words now. But it's not about us being able to use these words now. We have always been using these words. And it's not that the Oxford English Dictionary is magically this institution which grants us legitimacy to use our own words. And this is not what the Oxford English Dictionary claims to be either, because their whole intention is to bring about this record of the English language as it is used. And the first editor, James Murray, back in the late 19th century, so late 1800s, him and there was also a philologist called Frederick Furnivall. Their idea was to say that English, wherever it is used in the entire world, however people use it, that is what is English. It is not something that is limited to this island of ours. So wherever it is used, however it is used, that is the English and that is English that is being practiced by users of English, and we should incorporate all of that, and we should consider that as English. And if you really think about it, I mean, if you look at so many words that we take for granted in the English language right now, we hear the word loot, bungalow, jungle, shampoo. We think of them as English words, but then they're actually from Indian languages. And the English language never collapsed because we have this Arabic origin word, algebra, right? And it never collapsed when the English language decided to incorporate words like moose, kangaroo, koala, right? So very much like that, the English language is not going to collapse. As Ciara said, it's not going to collapse if we add baila, papare, malung, osari, valawa, and all of that. And the other thing I wanted to point out was that these are also not only Sinhala words, these are Sri Lankan words, right? So Koturoti is Tamil and Sinhala both. And then even something like Valawa, which people think is a very Sinhala word, it actually has Tamil origins, so Tamil etymology. So you have all of these things coming in. So I think we can go back to that conversation about how words are not translatable. Actually, yes. Let's go to you, Savin. So you write across languages, you speak across different languages, and that means that you carry, as you rightly pointed out, you carry multiple ways of thinking and speaking, and in your case, in English and Sinhala. So how does that bilingual movement kind of shape your voice? And do you ever feel that you have to translate yourself for your readers?
Yeah, so for me, it's the difficult part is maybe this is a gift, maybe this is a curse, but trying to identify what language I'm going to write in when an idea comes up. So I tend to write poetry in Sinhala and verse in English because for me, poetry is more felt in my mother tongue. Although I like and I love English poetry, I think Sinhala one's up. That's the problem with me actually. I can't decide. It takes me a good 10 minutes when an idea comes to my head. I waver between what language to use. So that might be a gift or a curse, but and it's different as well. So I tried this experiment once. I wrote the same thing in English and Sinhala, and it was completely two different things at the end. So that is a good thing to have, but yeah. So that's why I named my book, the short story collection, Kata Kata as well, because gossip, rumor, it didn't have that effect. Kata Kata is something entirely different. It's not just gossip. It's Kata Kata. So it's how Sri Lankan people get to know each other. It's how Sri Lankan people communicate to each other, how they socialize. So that's what I wanted to capture with the name. That's why I used Kata Kata. And most of my peers accuse me of using false marketing or market. It's a marketing trick. That's what they say. Kata Kata kila dhammama, you can get some marketing. No, I can't. I couldn't have used another name for the book. So yeah, I think the mix of languages, the bilinguality. I once wrote a poem called Bilingual Sankara. In it, I says at the end, there's this Roman Empire, I can't remember his name, I think Shamangal, maybe Roman or French Empire, who says, if you have two languages, you have two souls. But at the end of my poem, Bilingual Sankara, I say, I have two languages, but it may also be that I don't have two souls, maybe I don't have any soul. Because now I'm not Sinhala, I'm not English, my language is something in the middle or something that's completely different. Maybe I'm lost. So that was a huge part of me growing. When I was growing up, that was a huge part because I was like, do I know Sinhala? Do I know English? Or do I don't know both? So it was very difficult for me to communicate communicate my feelings, communicate with myself. It was easy for me to communicate with others because I am very talkative and I like to make jokes and all, but it was very difficult for me to take my own feelings and put it into paper because the two languages were clashing with one another. And I'm still in that sort of battlefield, but let's see what happens. Yeah.
Oh no, this is very fascinating. Thank you, Savin. So I think we can continue the conversation with you on that as well. So I know that you have a strong interest in conceptual metaphors. I think that was part of your research some time back as well, and how these conceptual metaphors kind of move between languages. So could you talk about the use of local metaphors, idioms, and symbols that allow writers to tell their stories? And you could talk a bit about your writing as well.
Right. Yeah, so I'm very interested in using things like metaphors, idioms, and imagery in my stories because I think it makes stories really colorful and vivid. So the thing about conceptual metaphors is that they are in your head. So when you take something like life is a journey, so this journey, so research has found out that in Sri Lankan English, this journey comes from the Buddhist philosophy of samsara, where life is a journey. So we say things like, my life is not going well, it's going somewhere. So things like that. So I think when you take a metaphor, it's just you make a relation between a target and an idea. It's the same when it comes to a symbol or an imagery or an idiom. So when you take something like that and put it into your story, you take the way of thinking from your culture into your story. And when you take it somewhere else, you compel them to learn a little more about your culture, about the way you think. So if I'm to give you an example, I actually have an example in my collection of short stories, the Lanka box. There's a story called Wild Pigeons. So it is actually, the story is happening, it's a conversation between a young girl and a Buddhist monk. They are in a moving train, and then this man gets onto the train with a stack of clay pots. And so he has made them by himself, and he is planning to sell them in Colombo. But towards the end of the journey, he finds out that the clay of pots are cracked. And then he gets off from Dematagoda, and then he throws the stacks into a garbage bin, and then he just moves on. He just eats a kadala gotta and then moves on. So I actually used it deliberately. I used it from this Sinhala folk song. I'm sure you have heard of it. There's this Sinhala folk song, Ambalame Pina, Valankada Gena, Eka Bindapu Gona, Ekata Mata Hina. So Ambalam is like a resting place in a journey, and then this man who's there with the stack of clay pots, and this cow comes from nowhere and smashes his rover, and then he laughs at it. He says, Ekata Mata Hina. So in this book, it's a very fascinating book, Aspects of Sinhalese Culture by Martin Wickramasinghe. I actually found it from this book itself. So there, he says that the Sinhalese folk songs and poetry reveal Buddhist view of life, the expectation of loss as something inevitable, and a readiness to be reconciled to such a loss as the only practical course. So the pottery is a proverbial metaphor among Buddhist priests and villagers for impermanence. So I think this actually is what happens in life. We are chilling with a cup of tea in a corner, and then life happens. And we are here. So that is what I wanted to use so I wanted to use that in my story, because it was also an expression of where this story was coming from. And we know that language and culture are interconnected. There's this debate which influences which. But language also keeps evolving, it keeps changing, and we keep on inventing new metaphors, new imagery, and we keep on using them in our stories and in maybe newspapers and creative writing. So these things get codified, and end of the day, these things get added to dictionaries. So I think, Rochana, you can talk more about this change of language.
Yeah, thank you very much. So again, fascinating perspectives. About language evolution, I think the newest thing that's happening is that a lot of language change is taking place on social media. So you have new forms, even a word as simple as brain, for example. You would naturally assume, okay, brain is a noun. It's this thing in our head, right? So that's the brain. But then now, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but now brain is also a verb. So if you want to say that your brain is not working, you can say, my brain is not braining, right? So that is very much a term that is circulated around. Like, yeah, a lot of young people use this phrase. And then even something like, if you want to say that, this is not adding up, you can say the math is not mathing, right? And then you have other shortened words. For example, the word delusional is now shortened as delulu. To be delulu is to, kind of like fake it, sorry, what's the term? Fake it as you make it. No, yeah, fake it as you make it, right? Yeah. Yeah, so being delulu is that, being optimistic about everything, being positive about everything. And then that has been extended as well. So delulu is the only salulu. Deluding yourself is the only solution. And further extended, delulu is the trululu salulu. Deluding yourself or being delusional is the truest solution that you have out there. And then even something like riz, the word riz, it's extracted from the word charisma, and it is supposed to mean something like, to have riz means you have enough charm, style to attract someone. And that again has been extended so you can have riz, but someone can also be rizzed by you. right? So you can fall, you can be charmed by someone. So you have all these different things, and all of these words are being added to the dictionary. So I think a lot of people have this misconception that a dictionary is what introduces a word, but no, obviously not. These words have been in use, and then the dictionary is kind of just catching up to all of these changes in language, right? And also, if we want to talk about how these are perhaps, also another thing, these are not just like words anymore. You have a lot of multimodality. So now dictionaries, they have this institution, like this event called the Word of the Year, where they select this word that captures the zeitgeist of the times. That's how some of them phrase these events. So Riz was one of them. Brain rot was one of them a couple of years ago, yeah. And then goblin mode. You have all these different words. So in 2015, I believe, the word of the year was, by the Oxford English Dictionary, was the laughing emoji that you find on WhatsApp and on social media. So it shows how multimodal language is as well. And then there's this other phrase, I can't do it with my mic, but maybe Savin can do it, 6-7.
Yeah, 6-7. Yeah.
6-7. So that's a Gen Alpha term. So
Yeah.
it's not even. So it was dictionary.com's word of the year in 2025. So it's not even a word. It's two numbers, but it's this entire expression. It has a lot of culture behind it. Like Gen Alpha is a Gen Alpha word, right? So any other examples that you can think of?
So interestingly, when you were speaking, a word went to my head, which is Rastyadukarya in Sinhala. So that comes from actually Jamaican. Yeah. So for Rastafari, the god Rastafari, the Rastafari thing. So Rastyadukarya here in Sri Lanka is a word we normally use to describe tuk-tuk drivers. So it's a very stereotypical word. We say Rastyadukarya, but that came from because tuk-tuk drivers started listening to Bob Marley. They painted their tuks in, the colors, and they had wheat plants everywhere, the symbols, and they might or might not have smoked some weed. We don't know that. So that's where Rastyadukarya comes from. So it's basically Rasta, then turned into English, Sinhala, Rastyadukarya. So it's not just English. It's like the entire world now, every language that is there in this world is been, basically turned into other languages. Maybe they mix and create new languages, and some languages also, gets overshadowed as well. So it's kind of like Frankenstein's monster. So yeah.
Do you have any examples that you can think of like that?
I actually recently heard this very funny thing. I don't know whether anybody else has heard it actually, because we have this term pothering in Sri Lankan English. We know like pothering. So somebody recently told me it's not pothering, it's darani pathafying. So I think people keep on inventing new things, and I find it very interesting actually.
Yeah, actually I have an example. I'm glad you mentioned that, because my example was, going by that structure of brain is not braining. So I work at the University of Peradeniya right now, so it's all very green everywhere, green trees everywhere. So I saw this tree and the leaves looked very green. And in Sinhala, I said, the kola are kola-ing. And interestingly, kola is the word for green and leaf in Sinhala. So I was going by this whole brain is not braining logic, and I was kind of bringing it into my Sinhala as well. The kola are not kola-ing. And then I guess there are some other words as well. Like for example, I've noticed that the word trigger, for example, in Sinhala it's tipper venua, right?
Yeah. Tipper
yeah. So you have all these different, things that how we localize all these different words around us, and so pothering and kunukunufying, all of that. Yeah. So it's all very wonderful, and I think we can move on to questions now.